Alright, welcome back to my channel. My name is Stephanie Bree, and this one's for the nerds, the gamers. This is my Remembering the 90s Console Wars. Say what you will about the 90s as a decade, it was by far the greatest decade for video games. Just because of the console wars. In between 1990 and 1999, we had more video game consoles released in that decade than if you take that decade out and combine all the other years together. We had more consoles released in the 90s than we did in all the other decades combined. You had the Neo Geo AES. You had the Neo Geo CD. You had the Amiga CD32. You had the Super Nintendo. You had the Sega Genesis. You had the Sega CD. You had the Sega 32X. You had the Sega Saturn. You had the Sega Dreamcast. You had the Sega Nomad. You had the Sega Pico. Yeah, Sega went out of business for a reason, people. Christ almighty, they couldn't stop making game consoles. You had the 3DO, which came in multiple varieties. You had the Philips CDI. You had the Sony PlayStation. You had the Nintendo 64. You had the Nintendo Virtual Boy. I know I'm forgetting some. These are just home consoles. You want to talk about handhelds, you had the Atari Lynx. You had the Nintendo Game Boy, the Game Boy Pocket, the Game Boy Color. You had the Sega Game Gear. I know, another Sega. The Sega Nomad, another Sega. I know, they couldn't stop. You had the Sega CDX. I mean, holy shit. You had the Apple Pippin, short-lived as it was. You had the Atari Jaguar and the Atari Jaguar CD. And I know I'm forgetting something. I know I am. I've got to be. There's just so many game consoles in the 90s. So I read magazines in the 90s. I had a Sega Genesis, got it for my 12th birthday, and I had a Super Nintendo, got it 2 years later, to the month. I got it September. My birthday is in September. I got the Sega Genesis on my birthday in September of 94. I got the Super Nintendo September of 96. So 2 years later, I got Super Nintendo. I had an N64 back in the day. Hell, even the NES was still going, and the Master System was still going in the 90s. I don't know about the TurboGrafx. We'll throw it on the list just for a good measure, but it was pretty much done by the 90s. And I remember reading gaming magazines and just wanting a 3DO, wanting a Sega Saturn, wanting a 32X, wanting a Neo Geo, wanting a PlayStation, wanting a Nintendo 64, wanting a Dreamcast. They just kept making game consoles, and they just couldn't stop. And it was just glorious time. Man, you had 16-bit consoles, you had 8-bit consoles, you had 32-bit consoles, you had 64-bit consoles, you had CD-ROM consoles, you had cartridge-based consoles. You had computers that were cut down and shoved in a box and called a console. You had a literal arcade machine stuck in your living room with the Neo Geo AES. So let's hit the highlights. I've owned them all. I've owned every game console ever to exist except for a Neo Geo. I've never owned either Neo Geo or Neo Geo CD, and I've never owned a 3DO. I've had all the rest. I'm not counting the Pippin. The Pippin is more of a computer. And I'm not counting the Amiga CD32 because that was Europe only. So I'm going to go down the list of the ones I've had, the highlights, and my memories. So let's start with the Sega Genesis. I've already talked about my love for Sega, but I love the Sega Genesis. It's one of my favorite game consoles of all time. I had a lot of games for the Genesis. I had multiple controllers and accessories for the Sega Genesis. I had the Activator, the vest that you put on, and it gives you force feedback. Was that the Activator? Anyways. I had the Minister. I had the other light gun. I had I had Lethal Enforcers, and I had the gun that came with it. I had so many games for the Sega Genesis, I can't even remember. When I look at the list of games that were released for the Sega Genesis, I can't even be 100% sure if I had that game or not, because I had so many games for the Sega Genesis. Some of my favorite games for the Sega Genesis. I liked the Spider-Man, the animated series. I liked both of the X-Men games on the console. Jurassic Park is a fantastic game. Sonic, all of them. But my favorite is Sonic 2. But I also really like Sonic Spinball and Sonic and Knuckles. And yeah, I like Sonic 3D Blast. You know, I do. It's fun. I like Vector Man. I like Altered Beast. I like Streets of Rage. I like Golden Axe. I like Phantasy Star. Phantasy Star 4, I should say. I like Turrican and Mega Turrican. I like Castlevania Bloodlines. I like Ninja Turtles The Hyperstone Heist. I like Ninja Turtles Tournament Fighters. Mortal Kombat 2, Mortal Kombat 3, Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3. Mortal Kombat Sega CD, Mortal Kombat 2, 32X. Primal Rage, Samurai Showdown. The list goes on all day long. I could sit here and name Sega Genesis games all day long, and they're just glorious. I had 3-button controllers. I had 6-button controllers. I had Pro controllers. I had auto fire controllers. I had joystick controllers. I had steering wheel controllers. I mean, you name it, I had it. I was 100% all in on the Sega Genesis. It was my system. I had a Sega CD. I had a 32X. I had all the games, all the good games for those two systems. I'm not going to list them all because, you know, whatever. But yeah, I had a lot of good games for those two systems. I had a lot of memories. To me, I consider the Genesis 32X Sega CD one system. It's just upgrades, add-ons. I don't consider the 32X its own platform. It's just the Sega Genesis. It's an accessory for the Sega Genesis. The Sega CD is an accessory for the Sega Genesis. Like the Power Glove is an accessory for the NES. Or the Super Scope 6 is an accessory for the Super Nintendo. That's how I view those. That's it. That's all they were. And as accessories, the Sega CD is a damn good accessory. As an accessory, the 32X is a damn good accessory. You got Colibri. You got Cosmic Carnage. You got T-Mech. You got Shadow Squadron. You got Star Wars. You got Mortal Kombat 2. You got Primal Rage. Tempo. I mean, the list goes on. Just so many great games on the 32X. Doom, for crying out loud. A pretty good port of Doom. I never had a Neo Geo, but I always wanted one. I've read up on it. I know all there is to know about it. I have owned the SNK compilations, the Neo Geo games on compilations, Samurai Showdown, etc. So I have played all of those games. I had most of them on PS2 and PS3 and some of them on the Wii. And, you know, piracy, we'll just say. I played a lot of Neo Geo games, but mostly on the PS2 and the Wii. Neo Geo is a fantastic system. It's just too stinking expensive. I've never owned a 3DO, but I've played all of the 3DO hits, all the best games on the 3DO. I've either played their PlayStation counterpart, which as far as I'm concerned is good enough, or through emulation, which is a pain in the fucking ass to emulate, by the way. But I did it, you know. It's a good system, but it's not as good as some of the other CD-based 32-bit systems, we'll be real. Let's talk about the Super Nintendo. It's a well-known fact. I'm not a big fan of Nintendo these days, but I used to love Nintendo. I bought everything they ever made. I soured on them over the years, but back in the day, I couldn't get enough Nintendo. I had a Super Nintendo. And you know what? I did love it. But I don't like JRPGs, and I don't like 2D side-scrolling platformers that much. I just don't. Especially the collectathons. So the Super Nintendo wasn't my favorite system. It had some good games. Super Mario World, The Legend of Zelda, Super Metroid, you know. Kendo Rage was a good one. What else? Killer Instinct was a good one. I had a lot of games on the Super Nintendo. I had all the Street Fighters. Those were good ones. I just happen to prefer Genesis to Super Nintendo, but I did have the Super Nintendo, and it had some good games.
Got a good deal on pork.
So next I want to talk about the Atari Jaguar. In the 80s, I was an Atari kid. I had a 2600, I had a 7800, I had a 5200, I had a Coleco Gemini that played Atari games. I had an Atari 8-bit computer. I was all about Atari. They were the thing to have in the 80s. Then Nintendo came along, cut their throat, and let them bleed out. But that's another story for another day. I had no interest in the Atari Jaguar. I had a friend who bought one. He let me come to his house and play it. And me and all the friends that he let come to his house to play it made fun of him for buying it. I have no love for the Atari Jaguar. I am not sad that it was the system that put him out of business. They belong to be in the past for releasing that piece of shit into the wild. Sega Saturn is another big one. Now, if you're going to get into the console wars, you have to talk about Saturn versus PlayStation, but we're going to skip over that. We're just going to talk about Saturn on its own merits. On its own merits, the Sega Saturn is a pretty good console. No, do not believe the fanboys. It is not better than the Sony PlayStation. I had both. I have played the same game on both systems. The PlayStation version was always better. The PlayStation was the better system. I'm a Sega fan. I'm a huge Sega nerd. My online handle is SegaGamer12. I love Sega. But the PlayStation was better. Let's just face fucking facts, people, and quit living in a fairy tale world. If the Saturn was better, it would have sold better. It didn't because it wasn't. Let's just face fucking facts. That doesn't mean it was a shit system. It was a good system. It had great games. I had Bug, fantastic game. Clockwork Knight, great game. Virtua Fighter, Virtua Cop, Fighting Vipers, Fighters Megamix, Virtua Fighter Kids, those were all good games. Daytona USA, good game. I preferred Sonic 3D Blast on the Saturn to its Genesis counterpart, but I had both. I couldn't get enough Sonic, so it was good. It was a bit of a misnomer calling it a 3D game, but it was still fun. It wasn't a shit game like some people say. I had Nights into Dreams. Listen, I love just about everything Sega does, and I love the Sega Saturn. I hate Nights into the Dreams. Don't at me. It's not a good game. It's a fucking racing game pretending to be a platforming fantasy. I don't know what it's trying to be. It's literally a racing game. It's get to the finish line as fast as you can. It's boring as fuck. What else did I have? I had Children of the Atom, X-Men, Children of the Atom. I had X-Men versus Street Fighter. I had all those. Marvel superheroes, all those fighting games. It's a good system. Now, if you're a collector, I'm going to tell you this right now. Don't buy a Sega Saturn. The console itself, $300. The Mortal Kombat 3 on the Sega Saturn, $75. Mortal Kombat 3 on the PlayStation, $4.99. $4.99. Buy the goddamn PlayStation. Forget about the Saturn. It is a thing of the past. Leave it in the past. Remember it fondly, but leave it in the fucking past where it belongs. And just copy and paste everything I just said about the Dreamcast, the Saturn about the Dreamcast. The fucking Dreamcast is the reason Sega went out of business. I cannot figure out why people sing its praises when it was literally the game console that put Sega out of business. How can you say a system that sucked so bad it put them out of business is your favorite console? I can't fathom it. I think that people who call the Dreamcast a good console are delusional. If you're watching this video and you like the Dreamcast, you are delusional. That's all there is to it. The Dreamcast is an inferior PS2. It's barely better than the Nintendo 64. Barely better than the Nintendo 64. And the 5 good games it had were all available on GameCube. And they were better versions on the GameCube than they were on the Dreamcast. There is no point in owning a Dreamcast other than to say you own a Dreamcast. Which, why would you want to do that? I don't know. I saved N64 for last because this is the one I have the most love-hate relationship with. The Nintendo 64 was the beginning of my hatred for Nintendo. I don't hate the N64. I just hate the fact that it had no goddamn games. It's probably the best console Nintendo has ever made, and it had no goddamn games. They made exactly 297 games for it in its 6-year lifespan. You get more games than that on Steam in 6 months. It had no fucking games. And it had fucking racing games. It had like 35 racing games. It had like 15 pro wrestling games. It had a shit-ass ton of sports games. You take those all the way, what's left? Not a lot. Mario 64, greatest fucking 3D platformer of all time. Hands down. The only reason I would own an N64 today is to play Super Mario 64. And that's only if I couldn't play it on my laptop, which I can, so I won't. Star Fox 64, pretty good game. Ocarina of Time, pretty good game. Smash Brothers, fuck off. The original Smash Brothers, fuck off. I hate that game. Should not have spawned a franchise. It's a stupid game. It's a stupid game. I hate it. I hate Smash Brothers. Mario Kart 64 is pretty good. And I'm going to say probably the most controversial thing of all time. And I'm going to get a lot of hate for this. I don't give a fuck. GoldenEye is over goddamn rated. GoldenEye is a literal shit game. You want to play a first-person shooter? Play Halo. Play Doom. Play Quake. Play Unreal. Don't fucking touch GoldenEye. The only reason why people loved GoldenEye was because it was the only fucking game you could play on the N64, and so they elevated it to legendary status when it was a shit game that they had nothing else to play, so that's what Nintendo fans do. It's the only game on the system, so we have to say it's the best there is. If you would have bought a PlayStation, you assholes wouldn't have even touched GoldenEye. I bought both day one. I had both, N64 and PlayStation. I didn't pick one over the other. I played games on both. I played more games on PlayStation because it had over 1,500 games released in its lifespan, and the N64 had a measly 297. Half of them are sports games. Fuck off with the N64. And that's it. That's my console wars memories. You know, I know I'm going to piss people off, but I'm here to do that.